I'm delighted to be here. I want to thank the National Forum and Cicely in particular for the invitation. It's a wonderful thing to be part of a international symposium that is centered on, but it actually includes students. So it's really a treat. My task this morning at about the next 35 to 40 minutes is to think with everyone about how experiential learning can play a role in electronic portfolios. And to do that, and my slides are frozen. Let's see, let me try one other thing here. There we go. We'll take up 4 tasks. We'll begin by defining ePortfolios because it turns out defining the object in question is a really critical move. Then what we're going to do is locate ePortfolios in what I'm calling with some colleagues, spheres of activities. And spheres of activities, as we will see, are sites of formal and informal learning. They include the academic site, work sites, co-curricular sites, internships, and so on. And I'll explain a little bit to you how we came up with this notion and how it might play a role in ePortfolios. Third, we'll look at reflecting in ePortfolios, both on individual pieces of work and on the ePortfolio at large. And then we'll look at designing ePortfolios in 2 senses, both for the screen and for response. So to begin with definitions, I've got 3. There are many definitions we could draw from. I'm going to highlight 3, and you will see that these 3 show up again and again as we look at models. We'll be looking at 7 models, as you'll see. So the first is processes. People often think about ePortfolios as the result of 3 processes: collection, selection, and reflection. And collection simply means that students are, as it sounds, collecting their work in something of an archive. That secondarily, they are selecting from that archive. They're not showing everything that they could show. They're showing some subset. And it's a really good question as to why some pieces are in and why pieces are out, and who is making those selections, a point to which we might return in the Q&A. And then last but not least is reflection. Not a few people think that reflection is actually the heart of any electronic portfolio, but as we're going to see, reflection can take many different forms. And so it's important to identify what it is we actually want students to do when we ask them to reflect. The second point I'll make here is that in the States, what some schools have done has taken up that mantra of collection, selection, and reflection and added something to it that is very important to them that then identifies or brands their ePortfolio effort. So my example here would be LaGuardia Community College, and their portfolio is identified as collection, selection, reflection, and connection. Connection being very, very important to them. So you can see how this works as a way of understanding ePortfolios, but also providing a signature to certain ePortfolio models. A second approach that I think is very compatible with a competency-based framework is one oriented to genre or type of text. And a genre approach would identify or define ePortfolios as a collection of texts, different kinds of text. Could be video, could be PowerPoints, could be written text, and it could be software and so on, contextualized for a specific purpose and audience. That's pretty easy to see in competency-based models like pharmacy, like teacher education, like architecture. It's sometimes harder to see for models that are not competency-based programmatically, but it simply means that, and per Cicely's point, when people come together as a community of inquiry, it's easier to figure out what that might look like. And then last but not least, we might think of portfolios as one piece of a larger learning ecosystem. That involves lots of different kinds of what in the States are called high impact practices, things like placement exercises, undergraduate research, and so forth. It's not the only one. It is one piece in that learning ecosystem, but it's also the case that sometimes the reason people like that particular piece, the ePortfolio, is that it can house all the others. So you can have examples of undergraduate research. You can have examples of experiential learning. You can have examples of classroom learning all under one frame that's provided by the ePortfolio. The slide here is intended not for you to look at every single, good news, you don't need to look at every single item, not even every single highlighted item, but this is a list of ePortfolio models that are being offered on a single campus in the United States. And that allows me to make the point that there are lots of different kinds of models. If you look at the very top, there's one in American Studies that's identified as course organization. That's basically a module. There's one in art history that's capstone integration. That's a very, very interesting model, the capstone integration. I'm going to come back to that one, so you might want to hold on to that, because it's not just that it's capstone, it's culminating in somewhat the same way that the student models today are capstone-like, but it's also that they're integrated. So we'll look at different kinds of integration. Then the third one there is mentored research, which is something like, again, has similarities to what we're looking at today in terms of the pharmacy model. Then the next one is civic learning. So you can see that there are very, very different kinds of models. And we won't look at all of them. Of course, there's not world enough in time, but we will look at a couple to try to get a sense of what the range of models looks like and also what they value in those models. But before we do that, I would like to highlight a little bit about what our orientation is when we think about ePortfolios. So one question is whether we're interested in students' development only, whether they're interested in their achievement only, or they're interested in both. Because clearly, if you're interested in achievement only, then you don't necessarily have to concern yourself with stops along the learning journey. If, on the other hand, you're interested in development as well as achievement, then you really do need to think about, so what are some stops along the learning journey? What kinds of activities can we engage students in? What kind of reflective questions can we pose? So answering that question is really important, also for indicating what text you want students to collect. The second orientation, and they're not mutually exclusive, they can work together, is whether the model is school-based only. There are many, many models. I would suggest that maybe not a majority, but close to a majority of models are school-based only. That's, people are very interested in students meeting competencies or standards or outcomes, however you want to frame it. And so they're looking at school activity. But within the last, I'd say, 8 years or so, and we have people with us today, Tracy is one, Lisa is another who can comment on this as well, quite knowledgeably. I'd say within the last year, 8 years or so, certainly around the States, but also around the world more generally, people interested in ePortfolios have been interested in integration. Now, I've separated integration in lowercase from integration in larger case. And the reason is that there's some models that are integrated in a very small kind of way. And I don't mean that as a negative or a pejorative. It's just that integration is sort of understood as an embellishment. It's not really the main course. There are other models that are fully integrative. And in fact, they require integration. And you're going to see some of those. And that's why I've got the uppercase there. So when we say integration, we really have to pause and say, what do we mean by integration and how integrative do we want it to be? And then last but not least is experiential, which is what we're principally interested in today. So is it experientially focused? Like, are we really just interested in the experience all by itself, sort of in isolation, which we might, there are reasons we might want to do that. Or is it really more experientially integrated? That is integrated with other sites of learning, other spheres of learning, or is it both? So the orientation that we take will have everything to do with the model we design. And now, before I need us to go back for just a minute, before, see if we can we go back? Yeah, we want to go back. And we want to go back one. There we go. So one more thing before we look at models, it has to do with spheres as sites of formal and informal learning. And here I'm drawing on a research project that happily enough involves Ireland. So it's a research project looking at sites of writing for students, college level students, It includes four people in the States, my colleagues, Alexis Hart, Ashley Holmes, and Anna Knudsen. Actually, Anna has just moved to Canada, so she was in the States, she's now in Canada. Ilya Sullivan, who is at Limerick, and Yogesh Sinya, who is in Oman. And what we were interested in was learning from students about the spheres in which they write and the connections they see across them. So you can see that we've defined spheres of writing as circumstances and occasions for writing. And we operationalized or defined potential spheres as self-motivated, that's one. So something you will do on your own, you're in complete control of, doesn't belong to school or to anybody else. Co-curriculars, student government, for example, could be athletic teams. Internships, which I think that's probably like placement, pretty much like what we're looking at today with the pharmacy model. Workplaces, which refers to sites of work that students are engaged in while they're in college. Civic or community spaces, academic classrooms, and then other spheres, which was to capture anything that we had not captured for students. Now, what we found, we surveyed over 200 students. We interviewed 23 across all 6 campuses, and we found that every single student writes in at least 2 spheres, and most of them write in 3 or more. And if they're writing in those spheres, they're also learning in those spheres. And the other thing we did was we asked them to map those spheres and to show relationships between them. Now, the map you have before you, is one that was created by a student on my campus. The circle in the upper left is her school writing, but you can see that she has 4 other spheres and that she sees multiple connections across them. And that's what an integration with uppercase levels might look like from the student's perspective. So thinking of integration as spheres of formal and informal learning gives us another way to think about students' learning and how it might be represented in the portfolio. And you'll see that going forward. So last but not least, before we look at the models, design. So we are going to look at design as a visual practice, and I'm going to suggest 5 strategies that I think you will find to be helpful. But before that, I want to look at a second sense of design, which is design as a means of addressing an audience. And when we think about addressing an audience, we do that in the context of a purpose. There might be multiple purposes. It might be informing someone or persuading or demonstrating that you've met competencies or interacting with people in the context of the portfolio or inviting. I don't think it can do all of those things, but I think thinking about what that purpose is fundamental. And then that leads to some of the kind of features that you might have in an ePortfolio. For instance, are you going to have an email? Are you going to provide an email to its sort of general audience so that they all can contact you after reading your portfolio? Because this is a portfolio is actually a social document. So you want there to be some engagement around it. Do you want to provide an email that's really key to specific questions that someone might have? Let's say you're involved in undergraduate research, or you're involved in a particular placement at a particular kind of pharmacy. Do you want to welcome questions key to those activities? Are you looking for certain contributions to work that you're taking up? Are you going to provide a schedule of updates and say, well, here's my portfolio today, and I'm going to be updating it 3 months from now. I hope you'll return and visit. Are you going to create links to a blog that you might be keeping, or links to LinkedIn identity? So thinking about all this ahead of time will assure that you'll have an intentionally designed portfolio. So let's look at a couple of models here, 7 to be specific. So this is the first one that comes out of the model collection, selection, reflection, and connection out of LaGuardia. And it's basically an integration light, is what I would say. It's really focused on school. And you can see that when you look at the tabs across the top, which are the one that gets the most attention, I can tell you, having looked at a lot of these portfolios, is the one that has classes. That's where most of the files are. But the students are encouraged, especially on the About Me page, which is the page you're looking at now, to include something about themselves. And this student has clearly done that by highlighting, for example, his leadership roles. He tells you that he's a criminal justice major. He also includes a famous quote. I'm not sure entirely why, but I can tell you that in lots and lots of models, students include famous quotes. The famous quotes seem like intellectual or professional lodestars for students, or touchstones. So that is a way of personalizing an electronic portfolio in a very small way that is meaningful, however, to students. The next model comes out of Stanford, and it is an integratively focused model. So it's a science communication model. Every student who participates in this model is majoring in science. So you won't see any philosophy majors, you won't see any engineering majors, you're only going to see science majors of various kinds. And all of them are interested in communication. So this model operates at the intersection of science and communication. And the students are invited, as part of the design process, to think about all the connections they can make in their intellectual journey. And they're invited to map those. And you can see some of those here. So this particular student is a human biology major. She also has volunteered at a free clinic in Mexico. So you can see she's got a health interest there. She took a nutrition class at Stanford, which, as she says in the arrow above, taught me the relationship between nutrition and environmental science, which you wouldn't have seen that otherwise. You might see the nutrition class would teach her about nutrition. You'd expect that. But the connection to environmental science, you wouldn't know unless she told you. That's what this mapping exercise allows her to do. She also is very interested, you can see, in food security and social determinants of health. So that tells you that she's also interested in a policy angle on this particular topic. And then I'm just going to follow a couple of arrows. She has a passion for working with mothers and children, which we could connect to her volunteer work earlier. That leads her to take a class in psychology at Stanford. That leads her to think about the intersection between medicine and cultural bioethics. And that leads to a volunteer work as a coordinator of the Stanford Immersion on medicine series. So you can see how it's not just integration of two pieces, it's also a mapping of how they occur over time and what those connections are. That's a very focused, integrative kind of model. A third model comes out of Texas A&M and San Antonio, which has a predominantly Hispanic population. This model is very different. It's progressive over the 4 years. And the idea is that students will be introduced to a theme in each year. The first theme is Welcome to College, where students learn about college because this is an effort in your context at widening participation. These are largely first-generation college students, and so they don't necessarily know from their own family backgrounds about college, and the first year is spent learning about college. The second year is learning about the world and volunteering, actually. So learning about the world includes volunteering work. The third is learning about the discipline, and the fourth is learning about the career. So that's a different kind of integrative cohort-based model that happens over the 4 years of the undergraduate education. I'm not persuaded that this is something that will necessarily be of interest to this particular audience today, but I thought you might want to see it just as a point in contrast. The next one might be of interest to you, especially because they do some very interesting things in this model. This model comes out of the University of Albany, and it has 4 structural features to it. It begins with a seminar in the first year, which is taken at the same time that students take a writing class. Students in this model have to choose coursework from 2 pathways. Those are the green dots before you. But it culminates in a capstone. And the capstone is really important and interesting. So I want to spend a little time looking at that. And there are 2 buckets here in terms of points I want to make. The first is that it is not only open to all spheres, students are required, as you're going to see in just a moment, students are required to include spheres beyond school. If they don't do that, they cannot pass this, and this is a requirement. The second point I'll make is that for this model, students have to write a learning philosophy statement, which, as far as I'm aware, is the only one of its kind, period, and stop. its analog is a teaching philosophy statement that staff will be very familiar with because many staff have created one. Students have not, but they are asked to create, in this context, a learning philosophy statement. And then the last item here that is particularly important is that failure is actually included as an option. It's not the only one of its kind, but that's pretty rare. Now, what does that mean? What that means is that in an effort to meet outcomes, and the outcomes are before you along the left axis. So connecting relevant experience and academic knowledge is one competency, having multiple sources of evidence is another, a sense of self as an evolving learning is a third. So you can see all of those are on the left-hand side. But what students in providing all this evidence and reflection, they are allowed to say, in meeting this outcome, I had difficulty. And in fact, I had such difficulty, I failed. Now, can they give you a whole portfolio of failure? No, that would be ill-advised. It cannot be all failure. But the fact that they include failure, I mean, it's interesting and provocative. It's interesting because we know that a lot of learning comes out of failure. But in our models of learning in the school context, we do not provide for that. In fact, we penalize people for failing. So it's interesting that failure here is welcomed. And how one recovers from failure, what meaning you make of failure is very much a part of this model. So that this model is, I think, very interesting. The two other things I'd like to point out here are in the top competency, where experience and academic knowledge is required, students have to include other spheres. It cannot be only the academic. They have to go to the other spheres and talk about the relationship between learning in those spheres and the academy. And the second item at the close to the bottom has to do with the use of multimodality. That is, students are supposed to use the digital platform and all of its affordances, all of its capabilities to make the best case for their learning journey. And that's really interesting because a lot of ePortfolio models don't attend to digitality at all. This model does. And in part, one of the reasons this model does is that this model hopes that students will become global citizens. And in order to become a global citizen, you have to have a reasonable level of technological expertise, is the logic behind it. This is yet another model. I think that we're on number 4 now. This is from Loyola of Chicago, which is a Catholic institution in Chicago. It operates out of a Center for Experiential Learning. So it's all about experiences. Students do not have to engage in this, but if they want to, they basically sign up for a module. They can do any number of experiences. They tend to be oriented to social justice because that's the Loyola mission. So that's what Loyola wants students to get out of these experiences. And those can be a sort of Habitat for Humanity trip to a country like Haiti that needs earthquake relief, or it could be something in a local community in Chicago where there's ample need as well. What's interesting about this model, two things in particular. One is that the students come to it thinking that they basically have to meet expectations or don't meet expectations, hopefully meet them. But you'll notice that there's a number 3 here for exceeds expectations. So there's a kind of above the standard option here that students, I'm told, find quite motivating. The second thing that is very interesting is that the level of awareness and or the level of action that's required in exceeds expectations means that students are taking what they're learning and they're applying it. So if you look at, for instance, synthesis through reflection, which is the first item, students demonstrate a clear connection between the in-class and out-of-class components. So again, experiential, integrated, and integrated in a particular way. And it demonstrates exceptional insight in meaningful reflection upon the experiences. So here, it's not just insight, it's exceptional and meaningful reflection. The second item, which is relate experience to development. So you see they're interested in both development and achievement here. So again, relative to our orientation. So clearly articulates how the engaged learning experience contributed. And here you see again, multiple spheres. intellectual, personal, professional, and or civic, and demonstrates exceptional insight and meaningful reflection upon the experiences. So here, the first item is really oriented to the connection between school and experience. The second is much more spheres open. The third is the most interesting because that's where students are invited to act, to take action. Demonstrates how the engaged learning experience has helped put into action Loyola's mission to expand knowledge in the service of humanity through learning, justice, and faith. So that's really interesting because when you look at outcomes and competencies, sometimes students are asked to identify and locate certain behaviors, but they're not always asked to do that as a consequence of a particular activity. And here, that's the case. This particular model is from St. Olaf. I'm including it here, although, again, it's a very unusual kind of model because it's a self-designed major. Students create a self-designed major that occurs at the intersection of two fields. So earth science and mathematical modeling, for example. That's a real example. But what's interesting here are the outcomes that they have. And again, you'll see here, students are again being defined as active agents. So the first thing that students have to do is recognize connections, be reflective about intellectual and personal growth, build intellectual community, and build bridges to communities outside the academy. Now, I've highlighted building and building because that's where students have to do something. Not just learn, not just show us that they've learned, but they have to do something on top of that. And what's also interesting is the definition they provide for this portfolio. Now, to my understanding, this is the most technologically savvy set of outcomes for ePortfolios that I've seen to date. That doesn't mean there are others out there that don't equal this or surpass it, but this is the one that I'm aware of. And it points out some things we might want to be aware of, quite apart from the technology, though we'll get to that. First of all, the quality of the individual pages is as important as the meaningful coherence of the whole. So each individual page is important as well as the whole. It's also the case that they're interested in the clarity and the logic of the overall design. So again, to our point about design, this needs to be intentional and well designed. The extent of the portfolio matters. If it's too humble, too modest, then it's not going to be sufficiently extensive. If it's overly ambitious, it's probably not going to be done well. So the extent of the portfolio needs to be, as we would say in rhetoric, kairotic or appropriate. The portfolio's overall aesthetic quality matters, but I'll point out that aesthetics really is a function of discipline. The aesthetics for pharmacy would not be the same as the aesthetics for mechanical engineering, would not be the same as the aesthetics for philosophy. So it's unlikely you would get a general aesthetic. It's more likely it will be a function of the context from which the students are emerging. The creativity and thoroughness of the links. This model has described itself as being very linky because it understands links as being sites of connection, and it's very interested in connections. So the linkiness matters. The degree to which the rationale for particular links is explicit and sensible, so they're not random. And the critical judgment apparent in the selection of external sites. That's another important feature because often ePortfolios are not connected to external sites. They might be housed in a platform, but it's really a sort of self-identified platform. This one requires that students have other external sites that they link to. But again, it can't be random. It has to be intentional and meaningful and contribute to the overall ePortfolio. And the last one here is a portfolio module. And it comes out of the University of Virginia. You can see that the module is called, well, you could see, but I just passed it. So I'll try to go back here. The portfolio module is called Collect, Select, and Reflect. So again, back to our theme about processes. And this module is really about portfolio makingness. How do you make a portfolio? And so in order to help students learn about portfolio makingness, students are asked to create 3 separate portfolios. One that's a learning portfolio, one that's a presentational portfolio, much more oriented to sort of competency kinds of portfolios, and one is an exploratory portfolio. So the way spheres of learning are handled here is by dividing the portfolios up into different kinds. And then at the end of each of these portfolios, the students create a set of outcomes or criteria that are used to evaluate the portfolios. And you can see some samples there. But the other point I want to make here is that you can see that it says, finally, it says, finally, you will present the portfolio to invited guests at the end of the semester. That's a really important point. That is also a feature of the Stanford Science Communication Model, that they present it to a group of invited guests. And in fact, the students are required to invite the guests. It turns out not every portfolio model has a showcase event or an audience-oriented event, but many of them do. And almost all the programs where students flourish have such an event. And just as we have such an event today, where students will present two portfolios to us. It's a learning opportunity for students, obviously, but it's really a learning opportunity for us. So it's a shared learning opportunity. So now I want to think a little bit about reflection. Not nearly enough, but at least enough to get us started. And people in ePortfolio are very fond, I have to say, almost universally, of a definition of reflection that is informed by John Dewey's work, the educational philosopher John Dewey. So 4 criteria. Reflection is a meaning-making process. It's systematic, rigorous, and disciplined. It happens in community, to the point that Cicely made early on, and it requires attitudes that value the personal. So it's like critical thinking, but it's from your own orientation. As someone said to me once, after hearing not one, but 2 presentations I'd made on portfolio, so it took me 2 to get there, he said to me, "Oh, I finally get it. Nobody could reflect for me." And I said, exactly. So reflection, it happens in community, but it's a function of the personal. The processes include 3 important moves. The first thing you do is you occlude the flow of practice. That is, you stop the flow of practice. The second is that you review, often in the company of others, because it's a community-based activity. And third, you explain to others, because in explaining to others, you're really explaining to yourself in a sort of Vygotskian move. And in doing so, you move from specific to general, using the key terms or vocabulary of the discipline so as to theorize about what you've learned. Now, that's a sort of fundamental way of understanding reflection, but it doesn't tell us what kind of reflection. Reflection takes many, many different forms, from metacognition and account of process to self-assessment generally, or self-assessment in terms of outcomes or competencies, which is what we see in pharmacy and teacher ed. It could be synthesis, it could be an account of learning, it could be exploration, development of a theory, connection of new and prior knowledge, goal setting, writing itself, which is a genre. It could be a digitally mediated discussion. So it can take many different forms. And even a program over the 4 years of an undergraduate program or a combined bachelor's and master's is not likely to be able to include all of these. So a really important question is, which of these facets of reflection are important to a particular program and why? And where will students be invited to engage in those forms of reflection? Now, just to give you 2 very quick examples. This one comes from a program at the University of Virginia. It's a Spanish program. This is a capstone kind of portfolio because the students take 4 modules over 2 years. They take 4 modules in Spanish over 2 years. And they build that portfolio over the 2 years. And here are the outcomes for the portfolio. How did you become a better Spanish speaker, writer, listener, reader? That's 1. So a communicator of various kinds. Second, a culturally aware global citizen. And third, a proficient user of digital media. So that's what they're looking for in this capstone. You can see at the bottom, that they're very interested in community. They ask students to think about what ways they changed themselves or impacted others. So they're interested in community interaction. They're interested in connections between learning in the course and other personal and academic interests. Again, spheres of learning. Why did you make the choices of digital media that you made? And can you talk about the development of your digital literacy? So from an orientation point of view, this one is clearly developmental, but also achievement oriented. It's a both and kind of model. So look at a very different model. I want to look at the editing, writing, and media major here at Florida State. All students in this major have to do an internship. The internships can run the gamut. They can do an internship for an online museum. They can do a writing internship for the New York Post. They can work for a public relations firm that specializes in helping homeless teenagers. And all of those are real examples. And you can see that they do very different kinds of things. At the end of that internship, students have to create a portfolio. And I have to say that the reflection in that portfolio, and I have been part of this program, reflection in that portfolio was very disappointing. And here's why. This is what we got. Now, we're telling students now, don't do this, but this is in fact what we got. That's how we knew what to tell them not to do. It should not be a description of day-to-day activities. It should not be an evaluation of your internship site or supervisor. It should not be a recommendation to other students. It is not a laundry list of items you completed. It's not a checkout list. It's not a superficial account of the semester, and it's not a work log. So those are all the things it's not, which begs the question, what is it? And that was on us. We had not defined it very well. And now you'll see it's very focused, it's very integrative. And this is what students are asked to do. The first thing we do is we tell them how long it has to be, not a precise word count, but a range. This is, in order to do this task well, you're going to need basically this number of words. And then we give them a set of 5 questions oriented to their internship experience and how that relates to what they have done in school and what it means for their future. So you can see the first question asked about similarities between school and the internship. The second asks about differences. And in each case, they have to include a text from the internship that shows a similarity and shows a difference. The third question has to do with now their definition of writing on the basis of having had this experience. Then we go to spheres of learning. How did the internship affect your personal, intellectual, civic, or professional development? And then at the end, most important in some ways, how have you already used or how will you use what you learned in the future? That's really important. One thing that we know about reflection is that it's very important in understanding the past, but it's at least equally important in understanding what you'll do in the future. Reflection is actually much more future-oriented than it is past-oriented. So that's something else that this particular set of guidelines helps students understand. And very quickly, because my time is about up, if not a little over, design. So we've talked about design for response, peer review, for instance, making certain kinds of invitations, inviting certain kinds of responses, but also strategies for the screen. And very quickly, here are 5 that you might consider sharing with students. First thing is to review portfolios themselves. If you haven't seen a couple of them, it's just harder to understand what they are. So look at them, because when you look at them, you will see available designs. You will see features that are included in them, and it allows students to say, oh, I like this, I want to do this, I don't like this, and here's why. So it stages a really, really interesting discussion. So you've already identified features. You're going to consider, portfolios are in a visual medium. This is a visual medium. So you need to think about possible visuals, about a color scheme, a font style, photos of visual metaphors. Those are critical. You're looking at and you're looking through. So looking at matters, and explaining the logic. So what is the logic of the choices you're making relative to the representation of yourself? That's important. It's a digital identity, you as a professional, let's say, but also what you want the reader to understand about you. So thinking in those terms is really important. Arrange multiply. What that means is, and I've done this, this is part of a module that I have offered, a 1-credit module for students, And what I ask students to do is to create at least 2 arrangements for their portfolios, because in making different arrangements, first of all, they see different possibilities, but second of all, they learn things. They see things they hadn't seen before. So it's another moment of learning, and it helps them get to the final arrangement. And then, of course, share it with someone new. Before you share it broad scale, share it with somebody new who doesn't know you necessarily well, who didn't see you in this process, and who then tells you how well it's working for them. So the whole process of peer review that we use in other kinds of projects is important here as well. In sum, an ePortfolio then is a set of texts assembled for a specific purpose and audience through the processes of collection, selection, reflection, and design. Those texts obviously come from different spheres or locations depending on the model. So how many, which ones, and the kinds of connections students make are very important factors in thinking about the model that we want to implement. As is the orientation. Are we more interested in development, achievement, or both? Do we want a school-based model, one that's lightly integrated or one that's fully integrated, including failure? What does experiential look like? Is it really experientially focused in the way that the editing, writing, and media is? Is it experientially integrated, more like the Loyola model, or is it really both? And for all that you've done to listen, thank you very much.